ever had the feeling that the world is full of disasters, calamities, catastrophes? Well, so did our ancient ancestors. From wars to earthquakes, floods to famines, this series will reveal how scientists are now unearthing the evidence for cataclysmic events in the past and their disastrous consequences. Fabulous cities abandoned.
The city dies.
The people here meant to stay here forever, but something went wrong.
Battlefields, long forgotten.
It's hand-to-hand combat. It's not being done at long distance, so it would have just been a bloody and very violent affair.
We don't have any other archaeological site where we see a conflict of this dimension in that period.
Sophisticated civilizations toppled and lost to the mists of time.
I think it's up there with the modern tsunamis you see here in the news today.
To our ancient ancestors suffering these catastrophes, it must have seemed as though they were cursed. But science is now exploding those myths and rewriting history. In this episode, the Saxons and Vikings rampaged through Europe for 300 years after the collapse of Rome. But with fresh archaeological evidence from Scandinavia, we can begin to shed light on one of the greatest mysteries. Why did these pagan societies seem suddenly to disappear? The Saxons were warriors and farmers and people with strong pagan beliefs. Hailing from northern Europe, they'd chip away at the failing Roman Empire. And as Christianity spread from Rome with the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons in England and even the Franks, the Saxons of mainland Europe held on to their beliefs. But how long could they last? Obermarsburg in central Germany. Once it was a stronghold and a frontier where pagan Saxony met the Christian Frankish kingdom. A stone tower now stands on the site of the original wooden fort.
In Saxon times, because it was such a good position to erect a castle, this place was very important. From here, they could watch the area for many kilometers around the tower. So when enemies arrived, you could see them really early and you could do all preparations against the attack.
The Saxons were protective of their pagan culture.
On this place, there was a Saxon castle, and here there was something like a holy tree. And many Saxons from the area came to this place to pray to their Germanic gods.
The Irminsul tree was a sacred tree in pagan mythology.
The Saxons lived as free people. They lived in a very liberal way. They lived by themselves. There was no strict administration in the Saxon areas.
But all that was about to change as a new Frankish leader came to power. Charlemagne was crowned King of the Franks in 768 in Noyon in France.
Charlemagne was one of the first Christian kings who really had influence, and what he wanted was to have an empire which was completely Christian. He wanted the Pax Christiana, the Christian peace, for his whole empire.
According to the Frankish chronicles, Charlemagne told the Pope himself in 771 that he would do whatever it took to convert the Saxons. But how would he succeed where others had failed?
He went to Saxony in northern Germany, where the Saxons tribe lived. who were not Christianized yet. Charlemagne's ideal and his idea was to bring Christianity to all the tribes and countries that he could get hold of. And he started this war because the Saxons wanted to keep their original faith.
One of Charlemagne's first strikes against the pagan Saxons was at the heart of their religion, the Irminsul tree.
Charlemagne cut it down. He destroyed it. And instead of this holy tree, he erected the first church.
Charlemagne now declared war against the tribes of Saxony, but met with tough resistance.
Because of this tribal structure, there was no huge, big Saxon army he could fight against in one battle. And the landscape was very different from the landscape today. Dense forests, no roads. And for him, it was very, very hard to go to these different places.
Not only was the landscape an obstacle to Charlemagne, the Saxons had a charismatic leader.
There was a Saxonian prince called Widukind, and Widukind brought together very many small tribes to form a resistance against Charlemagne. In the first years, Charlemagne was sure that he had won the war because very many people got baptized. But quite soon it became visible that there still was a resistance, and this would last very many years. And it was also a very bloody affair.
Over the next decade, Charlemagne ruthlessly suppressed revolts by the Saxon population. He introduced the death penalty for heathen practices and earned himself the folk title, the Butcher of the Saxons.
He used torture. He used weapons. They were forced to baptize themselves, otherwise they lost everything. He killed a lot of the Saxon leaders. He deported people. He took many, many people from the Saxon areas, and they were resettled in the Frankish area, far away. So he wanted to distribute the Saxons.
But even now, the Saxons put up a fight. The records reveal that when Charlemagne stepped up his religious laws in 782, a Saxon army rose up and laid waste to the Franks. Charlemagne's retaliation for the Battle of Suntal was brutal. He's said to have killed over 4,000 Saxons in a day.
After that, the resistance was not so strong anymore, and more people became Christians.
Then came a decisive moment that irreparably dented the resistance movement.
Widukind, a prince who had led the resistance, he came to Attigny in the winter of 85 and was officially baptized as a Christian. And after that, the Saxonian War was won.
Of course, for the Saxons, this war meant the destruction of their culture. It meant the destruction of their way of life. They were not convinced at the very beginning, because when the method of violence is used, you only accept it because the other one is stronger than you.
It would take over 30 years of conflict before the Saxons were finally suppressed and their pagan identity erased. In 800, with most of Saxon territory now officially Christian, Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope as the first Frankish king of what would become known as the Holy Roman Empire. In a twist of fate, though, the Aachen palace and tomb of this new style of Roman emperor would be desecrated less than a century later, by another formidable group of pagans. The Vikings were romanticised in the poetry of the medieval sagas. But there's evidence beneath our feet that can give us a glimpse into the lives and deaths of these fabled pagan warriors and reveal how they spread terror throughout the lands they raided and conquered. Excavations in Norway in recent years have revealed previously unknown Viking settlements and the second largest burial mound in Scandinavia. Then in 2018, amongst the graves at Gjellestad in southeastern Norway, the team struck archaeological gold.
This is the first excavation of a Viking burial in over a century. This ship burial was found using ground-penetrating radar, and the signals clearly showed us that there was a ship-shaped burial in the soil underneath the field. What we found out was the remaining wood of the ship is decaying. It is in a bad state of preservation and it needs to be excavated as quickly as possible.
With the clock ticking, Christian and the team set to work with cutting-edge equipment. Viking ship burials were believed by these pagan warriors to speed their occupant to the afterlife. But what kind of ship was this? And who was buried here?
We use photogrammetries for each and every layer of the ship. That means once we remove one layer, we make like 100 photos and making a digital model of it. That's a really important new way of documenting a burial like this.
With so little wood left, it's only by carefully documenting the position of the rivets that the team can determine the shape of the ship. And its size reveals just what a rare find it is.
We have found all the remains of the ship, and that ship is a little bit longer than 19 meters, 4 meters at the widest. The Gjellestad ship is most probably a warship.
There would have to have been a good reason to justify burying a large ocean-going ship of this kind. Most ship burials would have been in small vessels.
We have found the remains of a burial chamber. It's placed within the very center of the ship, built on top of the deck. It's for the very few upper elite of society being buried in a ship like that. It's very special. Viking society, it must have been very hierarchical. There was the very top elite that we find in the graves. In total, for Northern Europe, I would say it's somewhere around 15 ship burials of this kind, and most of them are found in Norway.
Who could this have been? Since the grave shows signs of plundering, there isn't even any trace of a body. The team must look hard for clues.
Within the burial chamber, we found something like 8,000 fragments of metal. And those, of course, have been pieces of all the artifacts within the burial. So we have a really large puzzle to do now, trying to figure out what kind of artifacts were in there. One of the other things we could see in there was the imprint of an axe. That is, the axe itself was actually removed by the plunderers. We could only see the imprint of the rusty part of where the axe had once been.
Viking society was structured around a military elite. And in other graves at the vast Gjellestad burial site, the team have found weapons that hint at what the smashed fragments might have been.
Only rich people could afford them. It's a lot of metal, and metal was expensive. It's a beautiful spearhead. What's special about this one is that we have these inlaid decorations on it. It can be connected to a military elite.
But not everything in these graves relates to warfare. Viking pagan beliefs meant other cherished items were buried along with the dead as provision for life beyond the grave. But what can these tell us about this exceptional burial?
Some of the artifacts we did find in the remaining part of the burial chamber were beads. A collection of smaller beads. This blackish material, it's actually the very deteriorated wood from the ship itself. For every new piece of wood we can collect from the Yellowstar burial, we can narrow down the time frame of the burial.
And this tiny clue has helped them do just that.
The Yellowstar ship is a ship burial from the early period of the Viking Age, most probably between 800 and 850, more or less.
Could this ship have helped those pagan warriors bring terror and destruction to the monasteries of Britain? The first monastery to be attacked was Lindisfarne in 793, with the devastation of the Isle of Iona just a couple of years later. An escalation of violence that's often seen as the start of the Viking Age. But who was the warrior given such a ceremonial send-off? One find gives the archaeologists a clue.
This bead is made of amber. It's one of the larger amber beads I ever saw. It's really huge. Women wore beads as part of the dress, so beads might indicate a female burial. It would be someone, a very leading character.
It wouldn't be a first. In Sweden, recent DNA analysis revealed a grave filled with weapons belonging to a woman. Could this too be a Viking warrior princess? We may never know, but the Yellowstar burial has already helped complete the picture of the Viking Age of conquest.
Some of the most important things we've learned from Yellowstar so far is, of course, a lot about ship technology. This Yellowstar ship, it's very different from the Viking ships we know from before. We could see that it had a very small and slender keel, and it might indicate that this was a ship for rowing. We have found no evidence of a mast or the rig of the ship, but still they could all have been removed because they were in the way for the burial chamber once they built that.
Could the Yellowstar ship be a new type of vessel?
Did it have a sail or did it not? Because it could be from the very period where you're going from rowing ships to sailing ships. Up until the 8th century, there are no ships with sails in Scandinavia. Putting the sail onto the ships, it's a very important step because they become far more mobile. When it's windy, the Viking ships are very fast using the sail. You can make swift attacks upon land.
Will Christian and the team find evidence of a sail? There's more work to do to fit that puzzle of the grave ship back together. But the discoveries they've made so far indicate that the ship belongs to the early period of the Viking era, bridging a technological gap that takes the Vikings into a new age of conquest. It's cargo bearing testimony to the rich pagan culture of these early seafaring warriors. Coming up, the mystery of lost warships.
Just this onslaught of warriors hopping ashore and just causing mayhem and havoc.
What next for the Vikings as new forces held sway in Europe and beyond? As the first millennium came to an end, a new era had begun. Charlemagne's Christian Empire was growing in power, presenting challenges to the Vikings in the north. But there were new opportunities too, as trading was flourishing across Europe. The Vikings had come a long way since their days of raiding and pillaging 200 years before. Roskilde in Denmark. At the entrance to the fjord here in 1962, the most extraordinary discovery was made. 5 Viking ships, mysteriously lying on the seabed. Intrigued, archaeologists wanted to find out more. Had the ships of Roskilde been involved in a terrible tragedy? While archaeology has little to show for this period of the town's history, a mix of historical records and legend tells us that it was founded in around 980 by King Harald Bluetooth.
Roskilde would have been the primary town that you had, where there would have been a seat of royal power.
When they excavated the fjord back in the 1960s, the archaeologists came to an astounding conclusion.
We have these 5 ships here because they were sunk intentionally to make a barrier to protect the town.
The ships appeared to have been sunk on purpose.
They literally just towed these 5 ships up into the fjord, about 20 kilometres north of here, where they established a barrier across one of the sailing channels. They could block that and defend from enemy attack.
In a case of so-called block ships that would be used over the coming centuries, including by Churchill in World War II, the Vikings here had used old vessels as a defence system outside their precious capital. But who were they hoping to keep away?
As the time goes by and you head into kind of the 10th and the 11th centuries, it becomes much more organised and power becomes centralised, moving towards kind of royal power in each of the countries, also across the sea in Britain.
King Bluetooth is said to have united the tribes of Denmark.
Conflict becomes something of a different nature. It's much more political, it's much more strategic, and it's much more tied in with the rest of northwestern Europe. So they become a lot more advanced, I suppose you could say, over the course of the Viking Age.
Is it possible the Roskilde Vikings feared an attack from Norway? By 1030, the kingdoms of Norway and Denmark were locked in a battle for supremacy, and the Danish Vikings had taken more land than their rivals. With the help of experimental archaeology, Triona and her team hope to find out how the Vikings came to master maritime technology.
The way we figured out to reconstruct these ships is by looking at the found material. You can put the whole system of planking together. If you line up all the nail holes, you get a shape that locks itself into place. And in that way, you can build a ship like this from the measurements of the found material.
Some of the most important things that we've learned from reconstructing ships is to get a better insight into how fast they could sail, what kind of conditions they could sail in, what it was like trying to transport people and goods and so on.
The team picked one of the 5 scuttled ships to reconstruct.
The ship Sea Stallion was built here at the Museum Boatyard from the year 2000 to 2004. And it's a reconstruction of the long warship Skurrilud II. And the whole point of experimental archaeology is that you should test the ship in the waters that it was originally built to sail in.
15 years ago, Triona and 60 others put the Sea Stallion to the test with a trip to Ireland. What would they learn about the Vikings' skill at sea?
The first time we had these big waves coming towards us, and you're down in the ship looking up at a 3-metre high wave and thinking, oh God, and just expecting this wall of water to break into the ship and swamp it. And we were quite surprised to find that that didn't happen. The ship actually just rode up the face of the wave and then down the backside again. And that was really quite a shock, but a very nice one for us, that it wasn't how we had expected the ship to behave. And that when we sailed that day, but we were in quite stormy conditions, we had a modern following boat with us who was actually in bigger trouble and had a harder time trying to navigate those conditions than Sea Stallion did. So again, just a kind of really nice, very obvious reminder of just how well designed these ships were and how well they understood the sea and what they needed to build in order to be able to transport themselves safely on it.
The team had gained newfound respect for Viking craftsmanship. But what could the ships tell them about their success in combat?
They were just absolutely dominant in terms of maritime technology. It gave them the capacity to travel quickly, to travel in large numbers, And the fact that the ships are built as they are with a very shallow draft, which means that they can sail in very shallow water. So if you're a small settlement living on the coast, you would have been very vulnerable to this kind of attack. Just this onslaught of warriors hopping ashore and just causing mayhem and havoc. And obviously with the kind of weaponry that you have in the Viking Age, it's hand-to-hand combat. It's not being done at long distance, so it would have just been a bloody and very violent affair.
But while they continued their conquests, something had happened to the Vikings. These Norse warriors had begun to engage with the new European superpower and its religion. As they evolved from thieves into traders, the Vikings' networks grew, especially with Christian lands to the south. Religion was woven into the politics of the time, and conversion to Christianity would open doors. Legend has it that one of the first Vikings to throw off his pagan beliefs was Harold Bluetooth himself. The sunken ships at Roskilde could have been doubly protective, both of the royal seat of power, but also of the precious and powerful church. Coming up, where myth meets reality.
The invasion was a punishment of the Christian king on pagans who lived here.
Were the legendary Jomsvikings the last bastion of paganism? By the 11th century, the pragmatic Viking converts had travelled just about everywhere they could by sea and spread their influence over thousands of miles. But with much of Viking history based on legends, the line between fact and fiction can become very blurred. That's when archaeology comes to the rescue, providing us with the answers. Wolin on the north coast of Poland. By the 10th century, a thriving port town, and now the site of a village celebrating early medieval life.
Early medieval Wolin was in fact a big port featuring numerous bays. Ships were coming from Germany, Scandinavia, Russia and Byzantium to trade, to buy goods, to acquire goods here, to sell their stuff here. Especially in 10th and 11th century, Wolin became one of the most important places on the economic map of Northern Europe.
Its population reflected its international connections.
Here, like in many other ports of trade, there are people coming from different areas, representing different cultures, different religions, different customs. That is why this place is open to accept different traditions, different ways of organizing everyday life.
But at some point in the 11th century, Wolin collapsed. And mystery surrounds its demise. What did happen here? There are those who believe Wolin was the legendary Jomsborg mentioned in the Icelandic sagas.
Jomsborg was a place where a great stronghold was built, and it was the residence of a famous war band of Vikings who were famous for their courage, bravery, and military skills.
Viking legends grew up in the 9th century before the Vikings converted to Christianity. They were epic tales of war, betrayal, love, and magic. The Jomsvikings have a whole saga dedicated to their exploits and conflicts with the Scandinavian kings. The most notorious clash was in 986.
They embarked on an expedition to Norway that ended up with the famous Battle of Rungavagur, where Jomsvikings were defeated.
The saga paints the Joms warriors as courageous and defiant in the face not only of the superior Norwegian force, but the elements.
During the battle, there was a great storm that destroyed ships of Jomsvikings, killed some of them, and those who were still alive were either captured or had to flee. This was the very last, very famous battle of Jomsvikings.
Or so the story goes. Could the Jomsvikings provide clues about the collapse of the town of Volyn? Mystery surrounds the location of their legendary fortress. An intriguing find discovered in the 19th century looked like it might provide some evidence. A coin bearing the name of the Jomsvikings was rediscovered in 2014, having been buried in a box for nearly 80 years. It was said to have been found near Volyn, and for many it confirmed the town as the site of the legendary Viking stronghold. More finds would be needed to help back up the theory, and research continues on the ground to test that this was the site of the Viking stronghold.
The archaeological work in Volyn started in the beginning of the 19th century. Why? Because of the Jomsborg legend, of course. They wanted to find the Jomsborg. We are still excavating, and we have lots to do for probably next 200 years.
Archaeologists have found some tantalising clues hinting at a Viking presence here.
The excavations shown that early medieval Volyn was a huge town. Some of the artifacts found in Volyn had special ornaments. It seems that they were typical for the Vikings, but they have some small changes in this ornament that suggests that it was made here, and it was made by the inhabitants of Volyn, not only by the Vikings.
Could Viking warriors have lived in amongst the other populations at Volyn and even built a fortress here? What's certain is that in the middle of the 11th century, the town suffered a severe setback. Did the boomtown overreach itself, as some have suggested, depleting the soil and exhausting wood supplies? The sagas, though, suggest a more dramatic reason for its downfall.
In 1043, the Norwegian and Danish king Magnus the Good invaded Volyn. The town was totally destroyed and burned by invaders. This was not a typical Viking raid. The invasion was a punishment of the Christian king on pagans who lived here. The legendary fortress disappears, but this is, of course, the legend.
The truth is that much of Volyn did disappear in the 11th century. The town had to be refounded in the middle of the 13th century. Work continues to find out how closely reality mirrors the legend, and if it was indeed the site of a Viking fortress attacked by the Christian king Magnus the Good to stamp out the pagan faith.
Maybe 1% of the site that is excavated, tops. So it's still big unknown what we can find here in Volyn. There is still some surprises for us here.
Coming up, the Christian ruler William the Conqueror sets his sights on England.
The Normans have a sort of myth about themselves. They're descendants from Vikings.
We have to think of a human disaster.
Every schoolchild in Britain knows 1066 as the year that William the Conqueror invaded England and defeated the Anglo-Saxons. But what came next is less well known, and it's a tale of shocking brutality. While he'd won the Battle of Hastings and declared himself king, William had the rest of the country to conquer. For him, it was just the beginning. Like many Normans, William had a sense of destiny.
The Normans have a sort of myth about themselves. They're descendants from Vikings who settled in northern France. And they see themselves as kind of heirs of this martial, expansive regime. So they not only take over England in 1066, but they take over southern Italy and Sicily in the 1040s and 50s. They make inroads into Iberia and into Byzantium as well. So they're not just focused on England. This is part of a broader program of Norman imposition and expansion.
So when rebels rose up in the north, William saw a threat to his God-given mission. What would it take to impose his rule? Among the Anglo-Saxon opposition to the Normans was the 17-year-old prince, Edgar Atheling.
He is the last surviving member of the House of Wessex, so he thinks he has the strongest legitimate claim to the throne. And he organizes with the Scots, he allies with the men of Northumbria, and they decide that together they're going to try to overthrow the Norman rule in York.
Hoping to glean information about the uprising, historians have analysed the records that the Anglo-Saxons kept of the time. Started in the 9th century under Alfred the Great, the Chronicles are a collection of manuscripts spanning over 200 years of English history.
The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says Edgar the Atheling came to York with other English and other rebels and was received joyously, giving us a sense of resentment about the conquest.
When the rebels attacked the occupying force in York, it looked like the Normans' planned conquest could still fail.
William thought everything that he had fought for was likely to be in ruins if he didn't act, and the decision to march north is the decision of a man determined to face problems head on.
The Chronicles tell us that William wasn't content just to send his forces to suppress the resistance.
In the winter of 1069, he comes up to York personally. He brings up a small raiding party to go and subdue and punish the people of Yorkshire for these rebellions.
But by now, Edgar had escaped into exile. Frustrated not to meet the leaders in battle, William now escalated his raids.
One of the things that William did when he came up with his raiding party to Yorkshire is that they not only killed people and destroyed and looted their houses, but they deliberately burned crops and destroyed livestock as part of the punishment to the people of Yorkshire.
People's farms were their lives. It's how they fed their families. It's how they generated money to pay their taxes to the lords, to buy the things that they needed to get by. So if you take away that farm, you're leaving people to starve, to really suffer.
The brutal campaign was known as the Harrying of the North. But what was the scale of the destruction? Historians have turned to another written account from the time.
Domesday Book lists many manors in Yorkshire as waste and records that almost every house in York had been destroyed. Let's remember the survey took place in the year 1086, so this is a description 16 years after the harrying. The harrying of the North did create a famine. Manifestly, some places suffered much more than most, others. There is also evidence of cannibalism. We have to think of a human disaster.
And archaeology has provided unique detail about the human impact in the surprising form of coins.
In periods of conflict, we see lots more coin hoards buried in the ground. The reason for that is that in a world before banks, if you're threatened, you bury your wealth in the ground. We can date them very precisely. We know when it was buried because the last coins added to it were those of Edward the Confessor and Harold Godwinson. These are kings who are kings on either side of the Norman conquest. So I can tell you that this hoard was buried in 1069, and it's some of the clearest archaeological evidence for the harrying of the North.
Another clue lies in the size of the hoards.
We have some really small ones buried in York, and then some really big ones, hundreds of coins. Hundreds of coins is a small fortune, whereas 2 or 3 coins is the sort of thing that those right down at the bottom would have had access to. The harrying of the North, it's not something that affects only the lowliest or the highest parts of society, but would have touched everyone's life.
The scale of the disaster was in no doubt, and William's actions provoked disapproval. Just a few decades later, a Benedictine monk in Normandy estimated the loss of life from famine at 100,000. And he wrote of how shamefully William had succumbed to the vice of cruelty, writing, "He made no effort to restrain his fury and punished the innocent along with the guilty." Historians have long debated the reasons why William attacked innocent civilians of the North who had no connection to the uprisings.
The scorched earth tactics that William carries out, there's a strategic aspect to that, and that it prevents, should the rebellions resurface or the King of Scotland decide to come down or the Vikings decide to invade, from them using the landscape in a way that could sustain their armies.
Whatever his reasoning, William's harrying of the North ended 600 years of Anglo-Saxon rule and ushered in a new era for England.
In terms of consolidating William's conquest of England, it was extremely effective. It does mark the beginning of the end of English resistance to William. Ultimately, we must think in terms of the imposition of domination of a new regime, done in such a way that Yorkshire could no longer be the base for rebellion or invasion.
By taking his place on the English throne, William had fulfilled the dream of his Viking forebears and had conquered the Anglo-Saxons. And yet, the Viking culture of pagan warriors was now a thing of the past. The violence was not yet over, but a new age had begun. Meanwhile, new threats were appearing on the horizon, from climate change and severe weather to conflict and disease, devastating the lives of innocent people around the world. Next time, the scourge of leprosy hit Scandinavia earlier than we thought.
Leprosy came to Scandinavia with the Viking trading, most probably with slaves that the Vikings brought here.
Researchers on the hunt for lost towns.
The water would have come so quick that it would have completely drowned the whole landscape over here.
Can they find the cause of the floods that cut short thousands of lives, reshaped entire coastlines, and transformed the fortunes of nations, giving the people of the Middle Ages every reason to feel cursed?
Up now, we go in search of a land of myth and legend in Lost Cities of the Bible. Or over on SBS World Movies, Oscar winner Helen Hunt stars in the twist-heavy crime thriller I See You.